Well, let us conclude with this introductory part on general economic equilibrium. In the last lesson, we considered an economic system where product prices were given. For example, an open economy, such that prices are determined on international markets. And from this set of prices, we determine the internal prices of production factors, which by hypothesis were not movable from one country to another. Now, let us consider, to conclude, a particular case of a previous model in which both the number of goods which are produced is equal to 2 and the number of production factors. 2 production factors and 2 products. This is a typical case which is analyzed in international trade theory. Well, let us suppose, moreover, that constant returns to scale prevail in both sectors. Is it clear? In other terms, production functions are homogeneous of degree 1. If we multiply every factor by the same constant, also the product is multiplied by the same constant. Do you remember? By Salvadori's module. Well, constant return to scale means in particular that the so-called expansion path of a firm is linear. For example, this is the first firm which produces the first good. Given a set of the vector of factor prices, if you increase production, the optimal quantities of each factor remain unchanged. That's a well-known property of an homogeneous function of every degree, of any degree, but in particular of a first degree. Let us denote by, so we can substantially limit ourselves to consider the isoquant of unitary level, or unit level, because in order to compute the quantities of our factors which are necessary, for example, to obtain 2 units of a good, it is sufficient to multiply by 2 the optimal quantities employed in order to produce 1 unit. Do you remember from the second part of the course? So let us denote in this way. This is nothing but the unit coefficient of production. In other terms, in this case, we have this is A11 of W, and this is A12 of W. The optimal coefficient, the optimal quantity of factor 1 and factor 2 which is employed by the first firm, for example, if the vector of factor prices is that. This is so-called conditional demand of factors. We can compute at this point the unit cost of production, which is nothing but the total expenditure, which is necessary in order to produce 1 unit of the F good, where F is equal to 1 or 2, when the price system, the factor price system, is that. Well, the minimum cost, according to the usual procedure of cost minimization. Is it clear? In a general equilibrium, since there are constant returns to scale, do you remember, if both goods are produced, in other terms, our country is not entirely specialized in one good, price, the unit price must be equal to the unit cost. This is no property which follows from constant returns to scale. Profit is null. If profit is maximizable, it must be equal to 0. So we have the following equations. P1 is equal to C1 of W, P2 is equal to C2 of W. Well-known conditions for profit maximization under constant returns to scale. In principle, this is a system of 2 equations in 2 unknowns. The unknowns are W1 and W2, the factor prices. Usually, this system has more than a solution. It's not necessarily unique the solution of this system. However, we shall introduce in a moment another property which guarantees that the solution is unique. Let us represent the situation of one firm, for example, the first firm, in an alternative way. Put on the axis of the second graphic not the quantities of factors, but their prices, W1 and W2. And then consider the following equation. Let's suppose we are considering the first firm. For the second is the same thing, obviously. CW1 equal to a constant. Clearly, this is an equation which lies W1 and W2. And it is a decreasing function. Why? Because when the price of a factor increases, the cost of production increases as well. So, in order to maintain constant the cost of production, you must reduce the price of a second factor. Better, it is necessary that on the market the price of a second factor is lower. In other terms, this curve is the locus of all the factor price vectors which guarantee to our firm the same level of cost. Is it clear? It is decreasing. It is also quasi-concave. It is possible to prove this result by means of properties of a cost function. So you obtain this result. You can represent the optimal choice of the firm also in this way. When, for example, you have this factor price vector, it is easy by a well-known property of a cost function to individuate the vector of a production coefficients. Is a vector which is orthogonal to this tangent. This is a consequence of a fact that the partial derivative of the theorem of David with respect to any factor price is equal to the optimal quantity of that factor in order to produce 1 unit of good. So you can identify the optimal vector of employed factors simply by observing the slope of this arrow, which is orthogonal to this tangent. It's an analogous relation which lies the marginal rate of substitution, technical substitution among factors to their prices. In this case, the slope of this curve is equal to the ratio of the optimal quantities of factors. It's an alternative way to represent the optimal choice of the firm. Well, now, it does introduce the last property, which is typical of a well-known model in international trade theory, the so-called Echelon model. If you studied international trade theory, you surely remember this model. The assumption is no factor reversal between our two productive sectors. How is this property defined? It does introduce the so-called factor intensity, which is nothing but the ratio of the optimal quantities of factor 1 and factor 2 in sector 1 and in sector 2. For example, if factor 1 is labor and factor 2 is some type of capital, this factor intensity tells us how many units of labor are employed for every unit of capital. Clearly, these factor intensities change when the factor price vector debit change. Our hypothesis is the following: the factor intensity of good 1 is always greater than the analogous factor intensity of good 2 for every factor price vector. And attention, when W changes, both this ratio and this ratio change as well, but the first is always greater than the second. This no factor reversal. You would have factor reversal if for some value this inequality held and for some other W, the converse inequality. Is it clear? In colloquial terms, we can say that good 1, if factor 1 is labor and factor 2 is capital, good 1 is more labor intensive than good 2. On the contrary, good 2 is more capital intensive than good 1. Is it clear? Well, since the ratio of these optimal coefficients is equal to the slope of the isocost curve, we can represent the situation of equilibrium in the following way. Let us trace in the same graphic both isocost cubes. For good 1, when the level of cost is equal to P1, and for good 2, C2 W equal to P2. Why? Because in equilibrium, do you remember, prices must be equal to unit costs. So this is the set of all pairs W1, W2, such that the corresponding level of production cost is exactly equal to the market price of the first good, and the same for the second good. Note that the slope of this curve is greater than the slope of the other. It depends, obviously, on this inequality. We have equilibrium in this point, when our two curves intersect. In this point, the ratio between optimal coefficients as regards good 1 is the slope of this curve with changed sign, while for the second good is the slope of this curve. And you note that in absolute value, the slope of the first curve is greater than the slope of the second curve. However, you can represent the equilibrium factor price vector in this way. The point in which our two cost curves intersect. But put attention, every cost curve has a level exactly equal to the market price of a corresponding good, since this equality must be verified in equilibrium. Is it clear? Well, you can represent in this way equilibrium. From this graphic, you obtain the optimal quantities, equilibrium levels of factor prices. But as regarding produced quantities, there is another graphic with the usual error box, which will permit us to determine exactly the levels of production. But we shall see this second graphic after a short interval. But let us return for a moment to this graphic. This hypothesis guarantees us that our two curves at most one intersection. So you obtain the following result, which is fundamental in actual Ulim model. Given, put attention, given the international product prices, and so given these curves, you uniquely determine the equilibrium price factors. If this property would not be were not satisfied, generally speaking, you could have many intersections between these two curves. For example, that of good 1 would be this, that of good 2 would be this. Therefore, note that there are two different vector price systems, say W prime 1, W prime 2, W double prime 1, W double prime 2, which guarantee this system of equation, the solution to this system of equation. So, in the case in which this property is not verified, it is not possible to deduce univocally the equilibrium factor prices from the product market prices. Because in this case, given the international prices of good 1 and good 2, there are at least two possible factor price vectors which are compatible, so to speak, with the pair of product prices. This is important, extremely important in actually model, because in this model, in international trade context of courts, we suppose that every country has the same technology. So, for every country, these curves are equal, since P1 and P2 are international product prices, and therefore they are equal for every country. The result is that the equilibrium price factors are the same in every country, even if factors are not movable from one country to another. Equality of factor prices would be an obvious consequence of a movement of labor capital from one country to another in search for a higher remuneration. But in this case, factors are unmovable. But the consequence is the same. Since product prices are equal for every country, in absence of transport costs, of course, then also factor prices will be equal in every country. Equality of product prices implies equality of factor prices. This even depends on this assumption, because in this case, for example, in the first country, the equilibrium factor prices could be W prime, and the second country W double prime. There is no certainty that there is equilibrium at the same factor vector price vector. To conclude, note that in this result, the available quantities of factors in every country are irrelevant, provided that there is no complete specialization. In other terms, our country produces a positive quantity both of good 1 and good 2, then the equilibrium Factor prices are determined and are independent from the available quantities of labor and capital. This is a very, very fundamental result in international trade theory. But also, it holds also for a closed economy, of course. Well, let us have a small interval and then we shall conclude.